Excellent. All right. So thank you very much for having me on. You had asked me to come on and basically talk a little bit about revenue models, how to start an online business, funding, go to market, launching software, and covering both technical and non-technical. So I kind of flipped that and I said, okay, let's talk a little bit about my personal background briefly, a little bit more about what WatchMojo's done over the last 15 years. What was it that I saw in 2005 and 6? And then you could relate that to your own existence. And then, how we survived early on to then eventually thrive. What was one of the many turning points in our existence, which was in 2012? What happened throughout the 2010s in the so-called SVOD, AVOD wars between Netflix and YouTube, where we ended up in this new world order before even COVID in December 2019. And then how COVID is basically an accelerator of events. It's definitely a game changer. And what are the opportunities before you? So one of my favorite lines about entrepreneurship is living a few years of your life like most people won't, so that you can spend the rest of your life like most people can't. It's an anonymous quote. I don't know who said it. But entrepreneurship, I think, begs the question, agree or disagree, entrepreneurship is a privilege, not a right. I'll nuance that by saying that there's actually two statements in there, one of it being a privilege and one of it being a right or not. And we'll come back to it later on. A little bit of quick tail of the tape background. I was born in Iran in 1978. My parents decided to move to Canada and I came with them basically. Been here since I was 6. As Canadian as they come. I studied business, graduated in 99. Got married in 2005. I have 2 wonderful daughters, and I'm basically, reporting to them over the last 5 weeks as I'm working from home. I wanted to do investment banking, but I was lured by the web. Worked a bit in search before Google became a dynamo. Then I moved to online publishing from 2000 to 2005, doing both creative, editorial, and business tasks for Ask Men, which was the men's online magazine, got acquired by IGN, which got acquired by News Corp. And then I got the entrepreneurial bug after I got married in 2005, launched WatchMojo after Ask Men was acquired by News Corp and Fox. I started the company, got sued by News Corp, and that tied into labor law, non-competition. They filed an injunction. I actually went to court myself. And I won. Then over the 2006, hit by Lehman, 2008, that whole era got turned down by over 100 investors. Whole other presentation for another day. I basically saved up about $250,000, which is quite a good sum in Montreal, which is a very affordable cost of living, and that's an important consideration when you go into entrepreneurship. I indebted myself another $500,000 that I did not have. It was literally credit lines and mortgages until we broke even in 2011, and we've been profitable ever since. We don't have any outside investors. We're not part of any big corporate entity. And over the last decade, I've developed this expertise in copyright and fair use, published 3 books, published also 1,000 articles. Last year, I produced a documentary called Fox in the Hen House, which looks at young voters being drawn by socialism, billionaires calling out the inequalities of capitalism, and looking at the role of entrepreneurship to bridge the gap between the haves and the have-nots. 2015, Ernst & Young was kind enough to give us the Entrepreneurship of the Year award. I like cooking, traveling. I'm a prolific amateur soccer player in my spare time. I'm actually adapting my second book, which is Alexander the Great's autobiography, into a live production, once we could, no longer be physically distancing. The point of that last statement is to say, once an entrepreneur, always an entrepreneur, although there's another discussion to be had about what's an entrepreneur versus just being entrepreneurial. So WatchMojo, very briefly, we are one of the largest YouTube channels out there. We've expanded quite a bit into other brands like Miss Mojo. We've also expanded onto other platforms like Snap. We'll talk a little bit about WatchMojo, but I want to go back in time. 2005, when we launched, as viewers, as consumers, we had already started to go through many iterations of how we consume content. You had Real Player, then you still had the portals, Yahoo, MSN, and AOL. You had eBaum's World, that was like piracy frontline. And YouTube came along, and it had, it faced a lot of competition from the Revers and the Goobas and the Daily Motions and the Meta Cafes. And this was before really YouTube became king of the hill along with Netflix. Then when it came to content producers, I thought, typical entrepreneur, that we were late to the game. And the reality was that we were actually very much ahead. So what we ended up doing is, like our peers at Revision 3 and Next New Networks, we wanted to build our own and operated websites. And we eventually realized that that wasn't going to work. Search engines were not indexing video content the way that they were articles. And then we decided to embrace YouTube. Today, I would say we're probably, right now, there's probably a seventh wave post-COVID. But I would say, like, riding into 2019, we were probably more in the Empire Strikes Back era, where traditional media had said, well, wait a minute, we're missing out on the party. Let's develop strategies, editorial, marketing, and distribution, and monetization to have a presence on YouTube. So going along, in 2006, one thing that I recognized very early was content could be represented by a pyramid. At the top of the pyramid, you had super premium producers. They had no incentive to put their content online. And if you remember Time Magazine in 2006, the person of the year was user-generated content. So I felt like there was a vacuum in the middle where if we adopted the tone and the style of professionally produced content, but in a speed and style that was going to be more popular online, we could develop an interesting business. And so we ended up really focusing on that middle of the pyramid. And over time, there were some user-generated content types who, like PewDiePie, king of YouTube, kind of started to add a little bit more, effort into his productions. And there was this development of the prosumer market, so to speak. And I've been covering this for literally since day one. This is an article I wrote in TechCrunch, if you recall, it's the same pyramid. And it was just kind of trying to make sense of this industry where you felt we were pioneers pursuing the wild, wild west of web video, and there was really not a lot of money in the ecosystem. And, as others would say, Ash is an OG of web video. If anybody wants to guess who Steve Chen is, Steve at YouTube.com was one of the co-founders. So this is an email way back in May of 2006 where he's asking us if we are embedding YouTube content on WatchMojo.com, a little bit of bizarro world. And so we really started off, we were very horizontal, we were producing all kinds of content and we were putting it everywhere. And for the sake of this presentation, I want to go back to a turning point in 2012. Now, back then, 2006 to 2012, I mean, it wasn't like we were sitting there just waiting for success to come. We were trying a lot of things. We didn't want to pivot every day and change strategies. We were very much still committed to content production, premium content and whatnot. But admittedly, we were kind of like a bit all over the place. And while I thought we were very focused on video, we did lack focus. And focus is a relative term, which we'll get to. I had come out of a pitch with an investor, and it was probably like turn down number 95. And I was sitting in Madison Square Park in New York, and I looked to my advisor, and I kind of said, look, I realized that, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, I have to go to war with the army I have, not the army that I want or I wish to have at a later time. And what I meant by that is we were basically, we were doing a lot of things, but there were really 3 or 4 areas that we decided to bet on. And one was that I kind of had noticed that, wait a second, if you have these kids who grew up in the 80s and 90s and even before that reading comic books, and now all of a sudden that they were bankers on Wall Street and marketers on Madison Avenue, decision makers on Hollywood and technologists on Silicon Valley, well, they were going to come into positions of power, and these stories that they had grown up with were going to kind of weave into their everyday job. And as much as I didn't want to kind of admit it, because I like music and I like many, many things, I like history, I like TV shows as well as movies, I won't lie. I kind of, as an entrepreneur, I had to be comfortable enough in my skin to say, look, I'm okay if I give the proverbial mic to my clients and to my users and to my colleagues and let them kind of tell us where to go, instead of holding on to it and just being so confident that I know what the audience wants. And we really, really did kind of bet on this on this geek culture to overtake pop culture. I've always joked about the fact that executives are sadists. They're very good because they have no problem inflicting pain onto others. But entrepreneurs, we're kind of masochists. We're driven by insecurities, and there's good and bad. And I wanted to kind of build a brand and leave a legacy of this popular new brand of the 21st century that consumers were passionate about. And I won't lie, it was kind of like I didn't really mind if the focus was going to be more music or eventually TV programming and movies and pop culture, because ultimately I did feel like, to me anyway, that was a means to an end. So I was okay to let that go for things to become bigger. And if you fast forward to today, if you would have asked yourself, would Big Bang Theory be the #1 show on TV, or would Marvel become like the biggest selling movie franchise, people would have thought we were crazy. The second bet we made was, look, whether, we did not invent the top 10 list, Letterman, Moses, the 10 Commandments, we have short attention spans, and we are drawn to this kind of format, and nobody was really doing it on YouTube, and we nailed the style for YouTube. The next one is this concept of, the VCs always talk about product market fit, and I felt it was important to develop a format, in our case, top 10s, using voiceover and clips on YouTube. So that basically you could apply to anything. It could be, again, post-COVID, pre-COVID. It could be, a given coffee brand in a given city that is lacking. It could be a given, SaaS product that is lacking in a given vertical that you recognize. I think that product market fit in content, I definitely think a lot about platform format fit. And then the last thing I realized was the power of this kind of like not just storyteller, but storytellers and entrepreneurs. To quote Steve Jobs, the most powerful person in the world is a storyteller who sets the vision, values, and agenda of an entire generation that is to come. And for me anyway, what I realized was that there was a lot of great storytellers and there was a lot of great entrepreneurs, but there were very few creatives who could read a P&L and ensure that their companies would not run out of money, which is ultimately the #1 job of a CEO operator, is not to run out of money. So the rest, as some would say, is history. WatchMojo really grew once we embraced top 10 lists and movies and fandom and all that, and fair use. We were comfortable to dabble in copyrighted clips, and our audience grew. We went from less than 100,000 subscribers to today, if you include all the channels, we have over 40 million subscribers, of which 22 come from the main flagship channel alone. And I would say the most interesting stat here is probably our reach, which is 115 million unique viewers a month. That's a proxy of the YouTube platform, which is massive. And then in an era of short attention span, on average, our fans spend 6 minutes watching our videos, which is kind of unheard of. Now, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about what was going on in the industry. So the 2010s were extremely busy. As recent as then, Time Warner's chairman, Jeff Bezos, basically got up there and he compared Netflix, who was reporting earnings today, and he compared Netflix to the Albanian army when asked if he should worry about it. And he probably shouldn't have said that, because what happened to Netflix since then, this line is when he made that comment, it basically grew, and right now it's hovering around $4.50 a share. So clearly, a lot of lessons there. And then ultimately, Time Warner, for lack of better words, threw in the towel as an independent company and decided to sell itself for $85 billion to AT&T. Obviously not a bad outcome, and they have fantastic IP and they'll be fine. But the point is just to be always very careful of discounting trends, discounting your competition. And over time, what ended up happening is YouTube and Netflix in the video space essentially carved up the landscape. YouTube became masters of AVOD, which is advertising video on demand, and Netflix became masters of SVOD, which is subscription video on demand. And they're both giant corporations with audiences and armies of employees going across borders. Now, to me, I would say Netflix is more evolutionary. They've basically taken programming that we're accustomed to seeing, and they've kind of evolved into more convenience where you could watch it on demand and whatnot. Whereas YouTube is more revolutionary. They've totally changed what is content, what is quality. They've not only given the power of programming to fans and letting them what they want to watch, but they've also given the power of what advertising we want to sit through skippable ads and TrueView, which is absolutely revolutionary. And so Netflix and YouTube's success woke up traditional media, and it's always been a content arms race, right? I mean, Disney spends a lot of money. These are all going to go up: Comcast, AT&T, Warner Media, Netflix. So, these are companies that spend billions and billions, and it is really the way that these companies differentiate is through IP. You've heard the saying, nobody really cared about AMC. They cared that Mad Men was the show that they were watching. Same thing with HBO. HBO was a great brand, but people cared about Game of Thrones and so on. And so aggregate dollars in traditional actually still remain massive. As much as you've seen this huge shift of audience online, the reality is that these traditional media companies are still garnering all the real dollars that stem from programming, but there's been this market dislocation because advertising has in fact shifted towards Facebook and Google online. And I would say that viewership, it's really only recently that you've seen more consumption of content, of video programming through the internet than on TV. Now, there's a little bit of an asterisk here, which is I don't think that you necessarily saw anybody come and kill Hollywood. I think what you saw was eventually Hollywood embrace the web as a distribution model. And I would say that is what is ultimately breaking the dam. For years, you've heard about a $75 billion TV ad market. When is it going to flow to online, and who's going to benefit from that? And the irony is you will see kids watching PewDiePie on their smart TVs through over-the-top connected devices, and you will watch somebody watching Game of Thrones on their mobile device or on their desktop or on their iPad. And so there's this kind of like blurringness of distribution screens and distribution platforms. And ultimately, whereas before marketers attributed a higher value to consumers who are watching on a TV, I would say that like there's going to be a convergence of ad rates. It doesn't really matter what you're watching on what device. It's more how much do I know about you, and behavioral and whatnot. And there's been this, massive amount of consolidation in TV, largely because of the threat of, these big internet giants, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix. And this consolidation has continued. And so in the 2010s, as I was always kind of giving presentations and I would point to that original pyramid, I realized that that pyramid evolved. And as an entrepreneur, you also have to update your playbook. And so whereas back then, you had this pyramid where you had super premium content on top again, and then user-generated content in the middle, and then you had this kind of like splintering where you had WatchMojo, like the premium content producers who were coming along, creating this kind of different styled content, different length of content, different speed of content, that kind of inspired, and in fact, even us with Fair Use, built on top of super premium IP. And then prosumers came along, and to an 8-year-old, there's no real difference between PewDiePie and Fox in a way. It sounds weird, but it's actually true. Now, it's not really a pyramid. That pyramid's been flattened. And what you have is you have those that own content, and then you have those that own distribution. And either through licensing or through the original greenlighting of IP production, you're kind of seeing this blurriness occur where eventually those spheres are going to lock into one. And that it's going to be one circle where you're going to have a lot of companies that own an audience, and through acquisition, they bought content, or they were content rights holders who through acquisition and investment bought into distribution. And that's what's driving a lot of the acquisitions in streaming platforms. Yesterday, Walmart sold Vudu to Comcast, NBC Universal, Fandango's group. Previously, you saw Fox buy Tubi. You saw last year Viacom buy Pluto. You've seen Apple with over 1 billion devices say, hey, we have 1 billion people that basically, flip a switch, turn on a button, and we have a screen in front of them. Let's get into the content game. And on the other side, you've seen some more aggressively than others, Netflix get into production, Amazon Prime get into production, YouTube license content. Facebook, I think, is more torn. I don't think Facebook necessarily knows how much it wants to be in that space. For Facebook, video is one of many things, whereas for YouTube, video is everything, so they're going to react differently. And you've seen the emergence of Twitch and TikTok, and obviously Snapchat as well. So I think it's important that you realize that, hey, what was my strategy and tactics back then has evolved. So what does this mean to you? As an entrepreneur, you're hearing this, there's trends, and a lot of it is in the background. What about the future? So there's no such thing as an overnight success. And when I was writing for TechCrunch, they wanted me to break down Mark Zuckerberg's success right before their IPO. And at the time, I said it boiled down to 6 things: ambition, vision, execution, persistence, luck, and timing. And I would say persistence is always the key. And over time, I've added focus, because I think only once you know what to focus on, you should focus on a given thing. And I love this quote from Calvin Coolidge, former president: nothing in the world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful people with talent. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb, et cetera, et cetera. Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent. And I agree. Now, VCs, entrepreneurs are always talking about Wayne Gretzky's famous, by the way, the St. Louis Blues win the Stanley Cup, then you have a pandemic. That's all I'm going to say. Coincidence? I'm not so sure. Anyway, so, Wayne Gretzky was famous for saying, I skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it has been. Everybody likes that. And I would say in normal times that makes sense. But the reality is right now, nobody really knows what's happening. Warren Buffett's sidekick, Charlie Munger, recently said, look, everybody's just frozen. They don't know what the hell they're doing. They're all negotiating with the government, so and so. So to you, I'm saying this in like the context, obviously, of entrepreneurship. I think COVID gives everybody a hell of a good excuse, but you have no excuse, right? I think one of the big challenges of venturing into entrepreneurship is there's always an opportunity cost. At what point do you leave your job? You have mortgages, you have kids. Like, when do you basically pull the Band-Aid and say, I'm going to get out of my comfort zone? Well, right now, nothing should be freezing you in some ways, and nothing should be holding you back. And I would say even in this moment of possible paralysis is the moment when you should probably be getting ahead of yourself. And COVID is many things. Just today, Politico announced layoffs at one of their units, and their CEO said, I quote, COVID has the elements of fear that we felt after 9/11, the financial worry that we experienced in 2008, and the unknown that surrounds a natural disaster like a hurricane or a tornado, all rolled in one, end quote. And yeah, that's enough to freak you out and make you want to stay in bed. But it's also a reminder that, we've gone through as mankind through the pandemic of 1918. Lenin said that war is an accelerator of events in history, and he's right, and this is going to accelerate things. And we've gone through the Great Depression, we had a pandemic in 1957, 9/11 was something that America never really experienced. I think Pearl Harbor was the closest thing, but it was still very different. And the 2008 financial crisis, which affected a lot of people because it basically made them lose their homes. But COVID is definitely a reset. And I think as an entrepreneur, you always see opportunity where others see unknown and fear. And I think that while it's tragic what you hear, you definitely need to look at it as a glass is half full, an opportunity. And it's an accelerator of events in the socioeconomic sense. I do think that COVID will do more than any politician or any election ever will. I think it'll pull America a bit more to the left. It'll encourage things like universal basic income and health for all, that Medicare for all, that I think were always very hard to contemplate in America, but that given the realities that 2/3 of an economy is driven by consumers, American policymakers may have no choice. But as an entrepreneur, I think it really just means that things like e-commerce, things like video conferencing, things like autonomous vehicles, things like online learning and whatnot, these are all areas that are going to be going by really, really fast. And it's like, hello, McFly, anybody home? There should be something that I'm saying here going, wait a second. I see an industry, I see a profession, I see a process that is about to be massively disrupted, and you are an expert in, and you should be seeing what I saw in 2005. Now, a lot of people talk a lot about following your passion. Look, it's true that people who kind of get on a soapbox and say, follow your passion, are already stinking rich. Now, they either inherited money or they were selling, some nickel ores or aluminum, whatever. And it's easy for them once they've made billions to be like, now I just do this thing for fun. So I would say before talking about passion, the test really is demand and supply. Demand and supply, recently you saw oil be priced in the negatives. That was more about futures of oil. We can discuss that on another time. It wasn't that somebody's going to pay you to go fill up your car. But the idea is if there's really demand more than supply, one thing happens. If supply outstrips demand, something else happens. Whatever you're contemplating, the laws of demand and supply are not going to go away. When I say would you do it for free, I don't mean would you actually do it for free. I just mean that things take 2, 3, 4, 5 years. It's going to be really hard. You have to love it. You would almost have to pay people to do it because there's no such thing as an overnight success. And then finally, number 4 is, do you have a comparative advantage? And I'll explain that in a slide or two. And then you could talk a bit more about the passion aspect of it. But I think just talking about as an entrepreneur, following what you're passionate about sets you up for disappointment. So mankind has been trying to solve the same problems, right? This fella, Plato, was a disciple of Socrates, and his disciple was Aristotle, and he founded the academy in Athens. And even going back, he talked a lot about this principle of specialization. Now, he talked about it a lot in like the ancient Greek society with guardians and craftsmen, and he talked a lot about, there's a parallel even between the id, ego, superego, and Freud's theory, but forget that for the context of entrepreneurship. I think there's something to be said about focus once you figure out what it is you should focus on. I think as an entrepreneur, and I don't mean to be contrarian here, the worst thing you can do early on is focus, right? You could have an application, you could have a bias, you could have a gut instinct. And I think if you focus too quickly early on, you're probably going to miss out on the bigger opportunity. And if I would have said I'm a passionate, music fan, and I just focused on music, I don't think WatchMojo would have been as successful as once we embrace geek culture around movies and whatnot. And the reason for that is what I call vision with a capital V versus lowercase v. Vision with a capital V is like being a visionary and, kind of seeing things when others don't. Vision with a lowercase is just like, I don't see the marketplace forming yet. When we launched, there was no economic model. Sometimes you don't have all the data. And I think what you want to do as an operator is kind of like leave yourself enough wiggle room that as you get a little bit more clarity into the marketplace, you can then tilt your big idea, your BHAG, your big, hairy, audacious goal to map what the market dictates you to do. And you don't want to miss out on that. And also, wishing is not a strategy, right? We love to have viewers come to the WatchMojo website. It was not going to happen, so we went where the clients and users were. We went to fish where the fish were, and that was YouTube, and we were rewarded for that because today YouTube generates more views in a given day than TV, which is a staggering statement to say. Don't be a sheep. Warren Buffett, there's a lot of great quotes from him. One is, you never know who's swimming naked till the tide goes down. You're seeing that a lot with companies that are struggling. It's not COVID, it's the debt. DEBT. Leverage has always harmed companies. But another quote I like from him is, don't follow the institutional imperative. I have been at this racket for 15 years. I've seen every fad come and go. It was tempting to follow the sheep, but I stuck to my guns. And one of the things that I resisted in doing was chasing things that scaled really quickly, but that were not sustainable. And investors are obsessed with scale. And in fact, I always felt that things that were actually sustainable don't really scale quickly. And the second you get in a room with investors, this and this slide alone is something that you have to just decide. Do you want to chase things that grow really quickly, which will draw investors, but that may, as an operator, be hard to maintain? Finally, your cost model is everything. Whatever, however you do, it's like the Yogi Berra line, you can't expect to make up for losses with volume. One of the reasons why WatchMojo has been able to do what we do, it's because we make smart decisions, right? We don't just throw money and try to solve a solution, because generally what happens after that is you still have the same problem, you just have a lot less money. COVID is a bit like entering bizarro world. There's always a Seinfeld analogy in everything I do and say. So one, bigger is not necessarily better. It's no longer in the too big to fail mindset. I think, if you're bigger, it's just really hard to make the tough decisions that everybody has to. Being agile is really key right now. Debt has always killed people, so that doesn't really change, but right now debt is what will just weigh you down. And cash is king. Well, I guess some things never change. The point I want to make though is you got to be realistic that the bigger you are, the harder it is for you to navigate with COVID, right? I was reading an article about New Zealand's prime minister saying that she's very effective, and she is. She's a fantastic head of state, but New Zealand has 5 million citizens, right? So, and they're like isolated from the universe. So I think sometimes we oversimplify problems, but the point I'm making at is you could fix problems. You can improve your workflow when you're smaller. So as an entrepreneur, it's tempting to scale and grow and say, look, we have all these employees and we have all this revenue, but the bigger you are, the more exposed you are. So until you really nail what it is that you want to be doing and how you should be doing it, size comes back to kill you. So a few slides to go and we're almost done. So this is why I go back to, I think the key of the principle of specialization is it allows you to eventually focus on where you have a comparative advantage. And if you go back to economic theory, that does tie into where you have a cost advantage. And ultimately, in good times, if you have a cost advantage, then you could scale and leverage and go much faster. But in more choppy waters, if you still have a comparative advantage in your cost model, your unit economics make sense, you just have a much bigger buffer. And one of the first books I read when I was leaving college and entering the business world was Jack Welch, former GE's CEO, executive of the century, who basically just said, the straight from the gut. I think as an entrepreneur, it's really, really easy to start saying yes and pursue things that are tempting. But the more you get out of your comfort zone, the harder it is to listen to your gut, and surrounding yourself with a bunch of executives who mean well but don't know the business as well as you do, as well as a lot of consultants who may have great ideas but don't necessarily, they're not in the trenches with you, that's how you get in trouble. And then finally, you got to start to drown out your biggest critic and your biggest fan. What I mean by that is they're both not necessarily representative of reality. When I started the business, I literally had people saying, good luck with that business, pal. Those very same people turned around and they're like, I always believed in you, buddy. It's not that they were necessarily, malicious people. It's just, you do have to prove yourself, right? Nobody's going to come and pat you on your back prematurely and help you build a business. It's up to you. You're in the trenches. You have to do it. One of my favorite quotes by Teddy Roosevelt, Citizenship in a Republic, the man in the arena. It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or whether the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the person who is actually in the arena, whose face is marked by dust, sweat, and blood, and who at the worst, if he or she fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his or her place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. End quote, 1910, Teddy Roosevelt, he knew what he's talking about. enjoy the journey. It's really not a destination. Super big cliche. Journey, what I mean also by journey, balance is a journey. We all struggle with it. I wish I wasn't so much of a workaholic. I wish I balanced things more. I found ways to keep my sanity. You're not going to be able to do this over a long time. You've heard the marathon analogy. Final slide, another quote. So I always say that success is many things. It's fluid, subjective, and relative. We're human beings. What I thought was success at 20 was very different than 27, very different at 42. As much as I don't care about my neighbor, it is still relative. We do absolutely look at things, sometimes just other entrepreneurs, other startups that get covered. And it is subjective, right? I mean, it's how you define it. And I think, to quote Steve Jobs, your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinion drown out your inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become, end quote. When I started WatchMojo, I believe we were done yesterday, so I'm gonna close off on this. When I started WatchMojo, I was covering TechCrunch, and I literally was still a guy who believed in content, whereas everybody else was kind of chasing one technology after another and raising money a lot easier than I was. And it was hard to stay positive and not become envious and not give in to the dark side and greed and envy and jealousy and resentment and all the 7 sins. And it was really hard, but I do think in a kind of naive way that once we became successful and had our share of success, it's because early on I was genuinely happy and I was encouraging others, and because they were, they had different dreams and they had different objectives, they were pursuing things that I think were a bit easier to scale overnight, thus getting money. And I admittedly took a very long route to finding our path. But in the end, there's little details of things that I would do differently, but overall, wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. Thank you.